I really appreciate everybody coming out and not sloping off to the pub and getting a pint. I know that's probably a temptation as it's already 4 o'clock. I was going to be really distracted because I wanted to go catch Peter's talk on one more thing, but fortunately he sent me a recording. So good afternoon. Caitlin and I have the absolute thrill to be here. Apparently we're going to have to keep separate because we're getting some feedback. We have the absolute thrill to be here presenting about designing buildable apps. And see, our premise is that designing buildable apps is a lot like building houses. Whether you live in a cottage where everything is handy and close, or you live in a house where you've got a few more rooms, maybe you've got a family room and a kitchen and 2 or 3 bedrooms. Or perhaps you live in an apartment building where your flat is just like everybody else's, but you're much handier to the shops. Or maybe you live in the heart of the city in a skyscraper and you've got an amazing view of the city. Wherever you live, we're all privileged to have a place called home. And because we have a home, we're all somewhat familiar with the process that goes into building that home. Even if, we've never really torn down the plaster and gotten electrocuted messing around with the wires. Because the fact is, people have been building houses for thousands of years. Probably more than that, really. But it's really rare for one person to build a house. It's a collaboration amongst specialists. You have your architect, you have your plumber, you have your electrician, you have your framers. All of those are specialists. But if you ask a software engineer, hey, build me an app, chances are good they'll fire up Xcode and try to get to work. And that would be a mistake. Because just like building a house, building an app is a collaboration between engineering and design.
So ideally, design and engineering are collaborating together, not just collaborating at each other, which is wont to happen sometimes. But often there are times with design where they're throwing something over the wall and you see it, and it's not buildable, at least not within 10 sprints or the timeline that you have for doing that. Either they're not using the components appropriately, they don't fully understand how they function, or they're using too many custom components and aren't leveraging the platforms that we're building on top of. So what went wrong? I think it's a situation where there's a lack of cross-discipline collaboration. And we'll get into a little bit more what that means in a moment. But I think that we don't have agreement between designers and developers always about what collaboration is, or if it's even happening. So one of my friends, Lacey Kobriger, wrote an amazing article called Unpacking Cross-Discipline Collaboration. It's on the Designing Atlassian blog. It's something that Jared Spool retweets every 3 months, like LinkedIn, all his socials, and has for the last 2 years. Every few months, he believes so strongly in it. So Lacey ran a survey between designers and developers, and she found out that 79% of designers reported collaborating with developers. That's great, right?
That's fantastic. But she also found that only 23% of developers reported that designers were collaborating with them. And that's not great. So let's take a moment to break this down. What we have here are designers who believe that collaboration begins the moment the designs are complete and they're ready to hand off. And then we have engineers who believe that collaboration should begin the moment the project begins. And we're going to assume good intent and completely ignore all of those engineers who think their designers just suck.
So before we get too deep into explaining what developers should be asking for from designers, let's introduce ourselves so you'll understand why this particular subject means so much to the two of us. My name is Caitlin Steele. I'm a senior design leader at Atlassian. Over the course of my career, I've done a whole bunch of different things before I even got into tech. But where I first started out was with a company called Masterclass, where I helped build it from scratch. And I was the only front-end engineer. And I was designing all of the responsive interfaces by just coding them. And then I took another pivot in my career and I ended up becoming a product manager for a couple years. And that's actually where I first got into native, was managing a mobile product in the medical space that no one's ever heard of. But the other things you may have heard of, where I was able to build out mobile teams, was at Lululemon, Trello. I did some time on Jira. We don't want to talk about it. And now I'm on Confluence. But ultimately, over the last 5 years, what I've been doing is building out native-specific design teams, where it is an area of expertise and craft, and taking a lot of times instances where there might be like one designer, where we're scaling up from one engineering team to an entire mobile org to a team of designers who have a balanced team topology when it comes to their design skills. So now I'll introduce my husband, Jeff.
So, hi there. I'm Jeff Watkins. I've been building software for just over 30 years. It sort of gets lost in the mists of time. The very first thing that I've done that you probably have heard of is this small thing called Game Center. I just have to tell you, I didn't have anything to do with either the green felt or the bubbles. I mostly did the sort of plumbing under the covers and various view controllers and stuff. After about 2 years, I decided to move back up to Seattle, and I couldn't stay as part of the Core OS team, so I moved over to work on App Store Connect for iOS. Now, if you like App Store Connect for iOS, that's great. We should talk about it. If you don't like App Store Connect for iOS, hey, I don't work at Apple anymore, so that's great. We can complain about it together. I left in 2019 to join a company called Wealthfront, and I had the great opportunity to build their iOS design system components. Now, this was fantastic because anything you saw on the screen, chances were good I had something to do with making that possible. I didn't do the work, I just made it possible, and that's a lot of fun. But the thing I discovered that I enjoyed the most was helping engineers be better engineers. And that's why I left to join ClassPass and become an engineering manager, where that's what I get to do all the time. So, as I said, Caitlin and I both build mobile apps. She designs them. I design the technical parts of them. We hang out at home because we both work from home, and we talk about building apps all the time. Sometimes we're complimentary, sometimes otherwise. We also renovated our home during the pandemic, and we noticed a lot of similarities. See, when you're renovating a home or you're building an app, there's an awful lot of planning. And then you get started, and it feels like you're just never going to get done. It's tremendously messy, and finally, it all comes together, and you've got something really great. But we noticed something different about renovating a home that we didn't notice about building apps in general. We talked a lot more about how we're going to build things when we're renovating the home than we typically do when we're building apps. There's a lot of hand waving when it comes to, oh, we'll figure that out when we get there, about building it. And it's kind of like an artist sort of sketching their dream home, right? Instead of an architect designing a home. So we're going to start with design. Before you pick up your tools, before you fire up Xcode, you need to know what you're going to build. And Caitlin's going to take us through exactly what you need to know before you fire up Figma to get started.
All right. So ideally, when you're designing anything, a home, an app, a building, you're designing for both appearance and usability. Like if you're building a kitchen, you want it to be somewhere that's great to cook in, as well as looking great. But another thing that happens in architecture all the time and doesn't happen in apps on average is designing in order to be able to build it, but also designing to maintain it, that this is something that you're going to be living with. Digital is not ephemeral. So I'm going to share with you one weird trick. I know just how clickbaity this sounds, but I want to focus on one thing, one fundamental shift in how you view product design and development that will potentially be helpful, because you don't need a 20-step process. You potentially, if you're working at a larger organization, have enough people focusing on process. And if you are at a small organization, like maybe you're to a place where you don't need that much process yet, but hopefully what I'm about to share with you is one thing you can do differently that will be helpful, whether it's you working by yourself or if you're working with a designer and collaborating. But first, an illustration of what I mean. So I'm going to be rhetorical. I'm not going to make the audience answer any questions. But what do you think when you see this image? Is it possible that you maybe think kitchen, sink, countertop, island, cabinets, cooktop? That's what most humans think. Some people are going to think about actions when they see that, but most people start with nouns when they see that. And that's because verbs require anchoring nouns. If I say the word run, it makes no sense without context. Is it a person? Is it a stream? Is it a faucet? You don't know what's running unless you understand what the object is. So what would we be thinking if we approach this kitchen the way that most product design happens today? We would have user flows about how to saute, bake, or chop. We would have user flows about allowing people to eat, clean, or organized. And that doesn't create the best designs, and it doesn't create the best data models. So my one simple trick is start with nouns. This is how human brains work, is thinking about objects. This is something that works in e-commerce particularly well. It works in content consumption, that it's very easy to clarify what your objects are. But I would also argue the more conceptual the model of your product, the more important it is to understand your object model, the way your users are encountering it, not just the way your business is encountering it. It's very easy to get stuck in a view of being inside out versus outside in. And by starting with nouns, that's the best way to anchor your understanding from the user's perspective. So I'll start with this. It's not my idea. Object-oriented user experience is something that is newer in UX. Object-oriented isn't new to any developer. But starting with nouns is a fundamental tenet of object-oriented user experience, OOUX. So that kitchen exercise you did a moment ago is something that Sophia Prater teaches in her object-oriented UX workshops. Here's her definition. OOUX is a philosophy for designing digital systems that respects the fact that people think in objects and need consistent, recognizable objects to understand an environment or product. So this is where designers can use your help. This is an ideal place to have a collaborative start for engineering, product, and design to build shared understanding at the lowest fidelity possible. Because why wait to the end when you have high-five Figmas to try and hammer out some of the complexity? Because that's where the uh-ohs are really expensive and annoying and take the most time. Whereas if you are starting with your object model, you're hammering out complexity in sticky notes. So this is something where, in order to do this with your designer, ask them if they've heard of OOUX. If they haven't, this is something where you can create a work item, story, ticket, issue, however you organize work that is happening at your place, and try and do this as early in a project as possible. If they push back and are like, why do we need this? Well, we're most likely building a data model anyway, especially if it's a large net new feature area. So this is something that is going to bring that end state work closer to you in a way, and then everybody's going to have this shared lexicon of what these objects are. So designers are always trying to build things that are buildable from their perspective. And I'm going to talk about one thing that sometimes leads them astray: the component catalog. We dislike it if our designers are giving everything custom or they aren't using controls the right way. So a lot of times they're going to these beautiful libraries. Now, iOS does have a Figma library. And if they go there first, they genuinely think that they're doing the right thing because they're like, well, it's a component. It exists. I used it. But it can actually make them choose the wrong component sometimes. Or sometimes if they aren't sort of really understanding how some of these things function, they could too quickly go to saying, we have to have a custom component because I can't get it to do what I want it to do, because they don't understand the way that you can theme components sometimes. I will say objects are not components. That's one important thing. And I think with some products, it's very one-to-one, like Trello, which I'll talk about in a moment. Like, these aren't necessarily platform components, but the components that exist within that app map very one-to-one with what users think of as objects. But a lot of times they aren't always necessarily going to map to each other. They aren't always the same thing. But if you understand your objects, it's going to be much easier to have the conversation about which components you should be using and when you need to build custom components. These libraries don't account for how things work. And a lot of the documentation is so far away from these like component libraries, like Figma versus like the documentation for a component. It's really hard for designers to connect the dots on those things sometimes. And also every year, these things are updated and consistently changing. So it's hard for them to keep on top of it. So it doesn't, like a library for a component, it wouldn't account for how a collection view works. Never mind a lot of the things that we're able to do with Swift UI now. So let's look at how objects play out in an app. Here's the Trello app. It's pretty straightforward. These are the objects that are within it. We have the workspace, the board, the list, the card, the label. One of the reasons that Trello is so successful is how literal its object model is for users. Kanban, it's super straightforward, they get it. But the instances of these objects that we're seeing here is, I've got a workspace, it's mine, it's got my name on it. Here I have a board called packing lists. We're hoping to move to Europe next summer, so I'm getting ahead of that. I've got a list for family room, which is sort of taking and encapsulating all of those cards, which are all within it, one for each item in the room, and then labels of who those items belong to. This is something that is, with Trello, it's cheating a little bit, but I wanted to keep it as simple as possible to talk about the concept of mapping the objects. So what does an object map look like? What am I talking about when I'm talking about that? It's kind of busy here, but I've got one column for each of my objects. Blue stands for object. I've got yellow for my core content. I'm going to have objects nested within objects, because not only is it important to understand what are the objects that are within my product, but what's the relationship between those? So for example, in a list will have cards, and I have one list to end cards. I can never have a card be in more than one list at a time. That's important for dictating my verbs and behaviors, but understanding how that object relates to another object. I may have metadata for that list, the number of cards that are in that list. And then the last thing I get to is my call to action. And so because I'm putting the nouns before verbs, you're going to end up with better verbs. You're not going to end up in a lot of these weird situations sometimes where you're designing something, and you're like, that just doesn't work quite as we expected. Or you realize there's a bunch of metadata that you need to display somewhere, but the designer didn't put it anywhere. And they're then like trying to like fit it in the UI. So this is something, if you look at oous.com, Sophia Prater, you can do it with sticky notes in real life. You can do it on the whiteboard tool of choice. I have a Figma template for this that I can share. But ultimately, defining objects before visual design is going to build that shared understanding with the lowest fidelity possible. Because this takes minutes. like not hours, in order to do this together with a group of people who understand the product that they're trying to build, versus at the end trying to retrofit these things. Another thing that's really useful about defining your objects this way, some of you may work on apps where you're the main product, you're the main deal. That's awesome. I've spent a lot of my career working where the app was subordinate to a larger web product, which can be really frustrating sometimes, particularly if we don't have the bandwidth, because we're smaller teams, to design in collaboration with them. Like we may have one designer to their 5 designers, and that we can't go through and create all of those mockups at the same time. Well, if we're building out that object model, that's a really low lift way to do that. And so it's a little bit like if you're building infrastructure for a neighborhood. Let's say native is the little house to the left, and we have that big web house to the right on some of these products that are like where the mobile is particularly a companion app. So ultimately, like by having that low fidelity and mapping objects, you can actually build out all that infrastructure. So instead of web building out all of the like plumbing and electrical and water hookups underneath the ground for their house, and then you don't have any hookups, it means you can do all of those hookups at the same time, because you're ultimately like planning a neighborhood out, which is really useful. So wrapping up this particular portion, nouns before verbs, because complexity costs money and time and energy. And so a little bit of planning up front is going to go a long way.
So it's great that we now know what we're going to build. We've got our object model. We've got an understanding of the nouns and the verbs. But the fact is, the object model for a calculator is going to be completely different from the object model for an enterprise human resources information system, right? And that means that the layout for those apps will be completely different as well. And it's kind of important to get your layout right, because you really do get basically one chance. So let's talk about layout. We're going to start with a smaller app, like a cottage style. Remember, cottages, everything's nice and close and easy to hand. Sort of like pCalc, a calculator, or the Apple Wallet. You look at these apps and they're immediately familiar. You can see exactly what you can do. Pretty much everybody knows what a calculator does. And with a little bit of fiddling around, you can figure out what you can do with the wallet. But with both of these apps, there's an incredible amount of complexity that you're not seeing. With pCalc, you can define custom functions, you can define constants. At one point, you could play an entire 3D simulation in the About box. Eventually that had to go, but complexity. It's kind of like having a cellar underneath your cottage with a home theater. There's any number of things you can put down in that cellar. You can have wine, you can have anything. That's up to you. But looking at the cottage, you'd never know it's there. In the case of Apple Wallet, as you probably all know, you can track packages, you can sign up for savings accounts, at least maybe over here in the UK and Europe. Certainly you can in the US. And finally, this is how iOS started. So these are really comfortable, the right way, right? Like originally, the landscape of iOS was sort of dotted with all these cottages. So everybody's familiar with them. It feels right. But the reality is, sometimes you have too much to fit in a cottage, and you need a house. Because a house is where you get to put more complexity. You have more rooms, more place for your stuff. And as Apple is pushing these days, we have a home feed. That's where you put your shoes, hang your coat. It's where your stuff is, and probably where the marketing material goes, right? Because we have to have marketing material. In the case of Apple Books, you can see I'm reading a book, and Apple thinks I might like to read these other books. We also have well-defined sections. just like in a house, right? I've got my bedrooms, I've got my kitchen, I've got my family room. So too in books, I have my library, I have my bookstore, and in Duolingo, I have my quests and I have my rewards. They don't overlap. They're very well defined. And the navigation for a house in both of these cases is through the tab bar. It's like the hallway in your house. Now, some houses, especially open plan US houses, don't really have hallways, but they do have interconnecting flows, right? And some houses are better designed for flows than others. And one of the things that happens with renovations is you come in and you fix the flow. And that's usually very expensive. Now, sometimes you have just too much complexity for a house, and you have to go for the apartment. Because the apartment isn't so much about the individual complexity of the unit as much as it is the overall complexity of the structure. And in this case, it's the structure as the app. So here, we're managing the complexity. We're using Confluence as the example, where the navigation tree is user-generated content. So I can create whatever deeply nested, complex navigation tree I want, but it's entirely up to me. And on the right, we have UDM Pro, which manages our network at home, because, nerds. And the functionality here is not so much on the pages of the app. That's more status. The functionality, you dive down from those pages into trace route, and manage the devices, and block people from your network, and set up rules about keeping your daughter off the network after 11 o'clock at night so that she doesn't stream Netflix until 2 o'clock in the morning. But that's completely hypothetical. And here, the navigation through the tab bar and those buttons to navigate down through the app is more like the elevators and the hallways within the apartment building, navigating you to the main centers of functionality. Because the functionality here is at the leaves of the navigation tree. But sometimes we can't even fit all the complexity into an apartment building. That's where we're going into these enterprise apps, into the skyscraper, right? A skyscraper is a lot like an apartment building, right? The whole goal is to fit a lot into a small amount of space. But unlike an apartment building, skyscrapers are often 40 or 50 or 100 stories. So the engineering challenges are totally different. And that means the engineering teams are different too. See, in a skyscraper, a lot of times you might have a hotel on the ground floors, apartments in the middle, and condominiums at the top, which means you have completely different engineering challenges for different zones of the app, or as I call them, modules. And the modules are the king of the skyscraper. Here we have Dayforce, which is a human resources information app or information systems app. It's one I use fairly regularly to manage the payroll for my employees, my team, the time off, promotions, everything you might need to do as an engineering manager on a regular basis. Now, the thing is, these modules are probably not all developed by the same team of engineers. They might not be developed with the same UI standards, the same schedules, or the same quality standards, dare I say. And so they all have to sort of plug in together into this skyscraper framework and work well together. Now, hopefully, none of you are in this situation making this sort of thing work, because it can be a real nightmare. So, good luck to you if you are. But the skyscraper is a whole different category of application. And here, the navigation is more about, getting you to the right module and then inside the module, there might be a whole nother set of navigation paradigms. So the most important thing that we can take away from navigation is we have to plan ahead. Because you might start out with an MVP, right? We all do. And you might say, oh no, it's just super simple. We don't really even need a tab bar. Everything's right here on this one screen. But it's not going to stay that way, right? It's kind of rare these days for a house to grow during the years, right? It happened more, 50 to 100 years ago. But your app is certainly going to grow. Every year, heck, every 2 weeks, you got new features. So you have to plan for that growth. If you don't plan for that growth, you're going to be sad. And then as you go to renovate your app, as you go to change things around, then you're going to be cursing past you. See, because as Daniel was saying this morning, the iOS SDK came out in 2008. That means we've been building apps for 16 years. And it means we have way more apps to renovate than opportunities to build brand new ones. So we are always opening up the walls and finding out what horrors lies behind the plaster. As I said, during the pandemic, Caitlin and I renovated our house. And this house was built in 1905. So it's really well built. And it had previously been renovated in 1989. And they made some questionable choices. There was a lot of colored marble, gold tone fixtures, just, things. One of them was the kitchen. And that was our first stop on the renovation. See, it was perfectly renovated to suit the owner of the house. She did a lot of entertaining. She did all the cooking. But that's not how Caitlin and I work. We share the cooking responsibilities, and we frequently actually entertain in our kitchen like, most normal human beings. And so what we had was something we referred to as a one-butt kitchen. Only one butt could be in the kitchen at any given time, and that just wasn't going to work. And also, as you can see here on the layout, we had this weird set of stairs. From the foyer, you could go up the stairs to the second floor, but also from the kitchen, you could go up to the landing and go up to the stair, which was really weird and totally useless. We kept our shoes there. So I said, how hard could it possibly be to get rid of that wall and get an extra 3.5 feet? That is literally the stupidest thing I've said in 10 years. See, homeowners make emotional decisions. Oftentimes, we do things because we gotta, not because they're logical or the most sensible decision. This is our kitchen after it was partially gutted. And that's the wall that was going to go away. Now, our structural engineer assured us that was not a load-bearing wall. But as they started tearing things down, the city of Seattle said, yeah, we're not so sure. We're going to need some time to think about it. Give us 6 months. Now, as you can see, we didn't have a kitchen anymore. We were cooking in the basement. This was bullshit. So Caitlin, as the project manager, and our contractor put their heads together. This was to be a theme throughout our renovation. And they came up with a solution. A solution which, if I was not an emotional homeowner, would have immediately caused me to throw my hands up and say, wait a minute. we installed a beam. Oh, back, please. We installed a beam on the floor above the wall that we were going to remove, so that that wall would not be a load-bearing wall under anyone's imagination. So the wall above it was now the load-bearing wall. City of Seattle had no problem with this. They said, fantastic. The kitchen wall is no longer a load-bearing wall. You're good. This, as you may have guessed, was not the cheapest way to solve the problem, nor did it keep us on schedule. However, as the emotional homeowner, I was thrilled. We were staying in an Airbnb across the street. I got to look out the window and go, look at that beam. It's a lot like, oh, now you're not going to go ahead. It's a lot like replacing Alamo Fire in the app that I'm building at work. See, there is absolutely nothing wrong with Alamo Fire, in case any of the developers are in the audience. It's a perfectly fine library, but we don't use but like 20 to 30% of the library. So for all of that code, why should we have it, right? There's a lot more in there that we don't use. I'd just as soon get rid of it and replace it with URL session. Because pretty much every iOS engineer that we're going to hire will understand URL session. It should be great. But I then have to consider things like caching, right? We do a fair bit of caching. We do authentication, and Alamo Fire takes care of that for us. And we might need to do multi-part form data at some point. I've heard rumors about this. And I keep telling our server people that we should be doing certificate pinning. And I know from personal experience that this is very tricky. And all of these things are handled by Alamo Fire. And we have completely worked out all the bugs in our implementation of Alamo Fire in our app. So we would just have like these brand new bugs with whatever we implemented with URL session. And while that would be exciting to fix those bugs, it would be totally unnecessary. And as a, logical engineering manager, I just can't justify that. As much as I'd like to get rid of it, as much as I'd like to slim down our app and take this code out, I can't justify it. So back to our kitchen. One of the things that came out of gutting the kitchen is we discovered this pipe. Now we knew something was up there because there was a soffit above the window, sort of a fake cabinet. And we figured, well, there must be something in there because there's a fake cabinet there. And when we installed the beam, there was no longer space in the wall for that pipe. So we had to do something. This is one of those things, right, where you're fiddling around with the code and now you've got it all broken apart and it's totally broken and it doesn't compile anymore. And your boss is saying to you, when's it going to work again? This is exactly that sort of case. That was the downpipe from the toilet in the bathroom above. Now we planned to renovate that bathroom, in about 6 months, or 9 months, or 12 months when we finally had some money again. But we weren't planning to do it right now. However, once again, Caitlin, and in this case, the master plumber, put their heads together and they came up with a solution. They figured out that if they moved the toilet now to its final destination, that we would be able to completely remove that pipe, which is fantastic. One small minor hitch. We had to cut a hole in the drywall in the bathroom and install the toilet in a closet. And for the next 6 months, we had to go to the bathroom in what we referred to lovingly as the murder toilet. You know, it was kind of looked like a crime scene, but it was fine. It was fine. So this is ironically a lot like what we're dealing with at a broken clicker, removing React Native. So I like to think that whoever implemented React Native at ClassPass before I arrived was smart. And they gave it some real thought in how to implement it, because there are two ways to implement React Native. You can use one single view controller, where everything is in the view controller, you've got all your React Native in there, and it all just works. So they say. And that would be great. But when I decided, or when the company decided that they wanted to slowly get rid of React Native, if everything was in one view controller, that would have taken probably 3 years to replace, because you can't do it piecemeal. You have to do everything all at once. Instead, they implemented individual view controllers. And that meant that we could replace one view controller at a time, because each one implemented React Native individually. Now, it's not quite the same as replacing the entire thing, right? We still have a fair bit of React Native, but we're slowly replacing each view with SwiftUI. And it works. And instead of taking 3 years, it takes 3 to 4 months. That's a huge win. And all because I like to think somebody thought ahead. So that's kind of what I'm asking you to do. As you're building, build thoughtfully. Because whether it's you or future you or somebody else who inherits your code, you're going to eventually pull open those walls and find out what's behind there. And ideally, the things behind those walls, the wires will be nicely tied off, the pipes will be labeled, and you won't be cursing past you. See, this is one of the reasons why I really encourage my engineers to write documentation, because future you will just love you. But without documentation, you have no idea.
All right, it's my turn again for a few minutes. So we talked earlier about defining those objects, and we talked a lot about components. So they're changing every year with the new updates as the platforms come out every year. Sort of it's a little bit like fixtures, some of these components, because you can have a house that stays the same for a long period of time. But if you're not updating those fixtures, you can walk in and you see a lot of wood paneling and you're like, ooh, 1970s. Or if you're not updating components in your app, somebody can walk in and be like, wow, that is very 2007, if that even still works. But I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of how to shape the conversation with designers for when you should go custom or when you should go standard, and a metaphor for theming. So we all know that heavy customization means tech debt and design debt are going to happen at a faster and faster rate. So I'm comparing this, it's a little silly, but it works, to installing a bathtub in a house. This is a component. I've got this freestanding tub. It's functional. It doesn't look terrible. It doesn't cost us much. I can buy it at home base probably today. And if I want to replace it in 10 years, I can easily swap it out. I sort of think of 10 years in house years, sort of like a year in app years. So it's like the 130-year-old house is like a 13-year-old app, which Trello is now 13 years old. So this is standard UI, that basic bathtub. So the app looks like it belongs. It's intuitive. Users get it. You don't have to explain anything about it. And it's really easy to update, where if, something happens over a period of time, or you just want the newer model. The acrylic on your tub is scratched. It's been 10 years. It's time. This is your standard UI. It's super easy. Maybe you want a fancier tub. This is something where I can still order this. It's coming from a tub manufacturer because it's ultimately, well, it's a manufactured tub, though we've added some polish to it. So say I wanted the claw feet to be oiled bronze instead of a brass, whatever it is, but it is still being manufactured, even if it's taking a little bit longer and is a little bit more expensive. So this is my themed UI, where here, for example, I have craft. It's using standard controls. It's got a UI collection view, but it can still make it awesome. I love what Craft does here. Like their animations, and they make it look like a distinctive app. It's really fun to use, but it's intuitive to use because it's using these standard components, but they've polished it up. It looks a little bit nicer. It doesn't look like the super vanilla out of the box thing. It's gonna be distinguished from other apps. So this is where it gets a little bit silly. When to go custom? And this is a conversation with design and product that is always kind of the fraught one. Because either maybe you have a designer who doesn't know native super well yet, or maybe you have a designer who has deep experience in web, and they really are trying to like push it to be closer to that experience, which we all know our user doesn't want that. They don't want your app to behave like web. They want your app to behave like all the other apps on their devices. They want it to be expected. And so it's a fraught conversation also with product because it takes more time, it costs more, it's longer. It's like what you're looking on actually delivering. And then we also know that reinventing the components is expensive long-term, your level of maintenance on it. So I promised Kevin Carpenter that I would have dogs in this presentation because Jeff had used cats in a lot of different presentations and he's really more of a dog person. So I'm stretching my bathtub metaphor a little bit, but what if I had 2 corgis? And what if I was someone who, I had a shower upstairs, not a huge bath person, but that these corgis were core to my life? Well, I could do a custom bathtub for my corgis. Maybe they're everything that I care about in my life. I don't actually have corgis, but using those as my example. If I had those other 2 bathtubs, I would be in so much pain trying to wash these wet, heavy animals with a low center of gravity in these high tubs. It just wouldn't work. So here's an example for the custom UI. I love what Warby Parker does with their AR try-on experience. This is as custom as it gets. They're capitalizing on platform capabilities with AR, but this is something that it's expensive to maintain. You can't just hire any engineer to work on it the same way you can with a standard component or potentially a themed component. But there are times where it is super, super useful. And I know that the bathtub metaphor in some ways is silly, but it's like if you're working with designers on the other side of the world, there are certain concepts that instead of necessarily like going down the rabbit hole of some of the descriptions of components on things, it's like almost everybody knows what a bathtub is. You can find a shared lexicon that you can sort of make an excuse with them that you're like, yeah, we could build a custom component, but it's like, why would you build a custom bathtub when you could buy this bathtub or buy this bathtub and then just have some customization to it to make it really easy? So ultimately on this one is just saying customize selectively. We're nearing the end here. I just finished up on fixtures. Jeff took you through framing and layout, and I talked a lot about design. We talked a lot about in the beginning, we had a picture of the cave, about how long people have been building, and we know that construction for homes and buildings have been happening for millennia. And again, the way that both Jeff and Daniel mentioned, that for only 16 years is what we've been building native apps, which is roughly 0.004% of the amount of the 4,000 years, roughly 4,000 years since the pyramids were built. There are always going to be technology fads. So if you're making careful decisions about how to apply these technologies, you're going to thank yourself later, or at least the person who inherits it later isn't going to be cursing your name and looking you up on LinkedIn to be like, where are they now? Best practices are going to be always changing. But this is something where mapping that object model, this is a trend that's happening more and more. We're seeing this best practice of mapping objects first up front. Best practices are always going to be changing, but as long as you're adapting, it's the same way as like in homes, new technologies are still coming out. Sometimes, as Daniel was mentioning, you want to wait a little bit and see, like people putting in Tesla house batteries. Maybe some of those people wish they'd waited a little bit on those things. But ultimately, the goal of building thoughtfully, of designing with building as the intent, that you can ultimately have better apps, which are more enjoyable to build and are easier to maintain. Thank you for joining us for this today.